If you're like most people out there, the silent era of cinema is a time surrounded in a lot of confusion.
Sure, we all know bits and pieces of this art movement, but most of it probably revolves around slapstick, gags, dance routines, and quirky romances.
If you get these images in your head when you think about silent cinema, you can most likely think two of silver screen's greatest comedians, Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton.
Of course, both of these giants were hugely successful during the silent era. They both also exercised an almost dictator-like amount of power over all aspects of the film's productions.
The true difference, though, is what happened after the introduction of sound in cinema.
See, Chaplin reigned strong for years. Even after sound, he continued to direct, produce, and star in many heartwarming films.
Keaton, on the other hand, quickly fell out of the public eye.
The introduction of sound in cinema, popularized by The Jazz Singer, meant death to an entire army of silent film stars. Many actors with foreign accents, squeaky voices, or just bad sound presence disappeared almost overnight when studios started to produce talkies.
Pierre, you shouldn't have come.
Can you give me just one more?
With pleasure.
Many studios even used this new era of film as an excuse to cut old actors from their contracts, claiming they simply weren't able to adjust to dialogue-heavy film.
Buster Keaton grew up on stage as a vaudeville performer and kept a very vaudeville-like screen presence with his comedy. His style was most known for three basic components: being the great stone face, never doing the same action twice, and making sure that everything on the screen was the real thing. No stuntmen, minimal visual effects, and maximum spectacle. This gained Keaton a reputation for being the most physical of the great silent comedians and earned him a right as one of the greatest daredevils of the century. Keaton believed that everything that needed to be said could be told through gesture and pantomime, and absolutely hated when directors told everything through title cards. While the average film of the time used about 240 title cards, the most Keaton ever used was 56. By early 1928, Buster Keaton had made 31 films independently. He took almost dictator-like control over writing, directing, acting, and post-production on everything he worked on through his own studio. But that was about to change. According to Keaton himself, in 1928, I made the worst mistake of my career. Against my better judgment, I let Joe Schenck talk me into giving up my own studio to make pictures at the booming Metro Golden Mayer lot in Culver City. So right in the middle of the transition to talkies, Keaton signed a contract for the first time in his career with MGM. He did this even against the warning of Charlie Chaplin, who apparently warned Keaton that they'd ruin his pictures and he'd get tired of fighting for what he knew was right. Keaton wasn't against talking pictures. In fact, he was excited to have the budget to work on them. The problem was that Keaton wanted his films to remain largely visual and have dialogue supplement the action, similar to how he was never fond of using many title cards in his films. This went directly against what MGM was looking for, according to a statement by then MGM president Nicholas Schenck, who said, "I don't like slapstick." If you look at talkies being produced at the time, you'll see that studios were pushing for incredibly dialogue-heavy films and were becoming increasingly less visually interesting, and actors had to learn how to adapt to let the dialogue take over the performance. Keaton wasn't willing to do that. Take a look at this final scene from The King of Champs-Élysées, considered Keaton's best talking picture ever produced, even though it never had a release in the United States. It's a sound film, but look at Keaton's acting. It hasn't changed at all from the clown character he played in the silent era. He's still pantomiming every action larger than life, which wasn't necessary in dialogue films. Even though it is a dialogue film, he still only says one line at the end of this scene, and this is it. Yes, Keaton did produce talking films, but every film was a fight between him wanting to do them the way he wanted and MGM trying to produce a film that would sell. As a result, the years of 1932 to 1934 were some of the worst in Keaton's career. He continually produced subpar, forgettable films that barely earned MGM a profit. He picked up the same drinking problems that ruined his father's career. He was divorced by his wife. He was sued by the IRS for $28,000 in back taxes, and eventually he was fired from MGM for unreliability. Slowly but surely, Keaton started to fade out of the public spotlight. He still appeared in pieces every couple of years, but never gained the same star status he wore in the silent era. It seems he was always regarded as a silent genius and nothing more. Take a look at this clip from the Ed Wynn Show in 1949, where Keaton was invited to be a guest. Wynn introduces Keaton as the greatest of all silent comedians and makes jokes about Keaton pantomiming on TV and creating silent television rather than letting Keaton answer questions out loud on the show. Instead of doing a typical talking interview, Keaton performs his first pantomime that was ever recorded on TV, again making use of ironic subtitle cards and all. It seems Keaton was just destined to stay a star of the silent era. It's not that he couldn't perform dialogue, it just seems that his real talents played with the visual part of the cinema, and later audiences weren't willing to accept that over dialogue.
Chaplin, like many film stars, grew up as a vaudeville performer after his parents had abandoned him and his brother at an early age. Chaplin, a talented performer, quickly gained fame on stage, which led him to join a comedic pantomime group, and soon after signed a contract with Keystone Film Company. After producing dozens of films for Keystone, Chaplin switched through various other production studios, ensuring that he maintained complete creative control over his films. Already a global superstar, the studios were confident in Chaplin's ability to micromanage all aspects of his films. But still wanting more control in the filmmaking process, Chaplin and a few of his co-stars started United Artists in 1919, and in 1921, Chaplin demonstrated the fruits of his labor with The Kid, the second highest grossing film of the year. Later in his career, he slowed his production pace, creating City Lights, Modern Times, and The Great Dictator. You could say that Chaplin's transition to sound was a slow one. Beginning in 1925, Chaplin partially adopted upcoming synchronized sound in his film The Gold Rush. Even in the post-jazz singer era, Chaplin was still reluctant to create fully sound films, with his films City Lights and Modern Times relying mostly on meticulously paced musical scores and sound effects. Even Chaplin said that he had a difficulty implementing speech into his scenes, stating, "Dialogue, to my way of thinking, always slows action, because action must wait upon words." Despite the lack of prominent dialogue in City Lights and Modern Times, Chaplin's films are inarguably classified as sound, as the exactly synchronized musical score and sound effects would be impossible to create on a nightly basis in a silent theater.
Hey! Quit stalling, get back to work! Go on!
Chaplin saw other issues with the implementation of dialogue into his films, particularly with his character of the Little Tramp. As a global superstar, having his films in English could pose problems for worldwide distribution. Even up to his 1936 film Modern Times, Chaplin preferred to advance the film with translatable title cards. Still, the world wanted to hear the Tramp speak, and Chaplin found an ingenious way to do so. At the end of Modern Times, the audience sits at the edge of their seats as the Tramp debates whether or not he will sing his musical number at the singing cafe. At the last moment, the Tramp begins singing. In a language nobody can understand. As such, Chaplin is still relying on his own skill of pantomime to introduce comedy into the scene. Chaplin quickly saw that this means of pseudo-multilingualism would mean Modern Times would be the final film starring the Little Tramp, and perhaps this recognition is what helped him maintain success until his last famous work, The Great Dictator, a film that relied much more on dialogue. Still using many of his imaginary and impromptu language skills, Chaplin finally gives the audience what they've been waiting for: English.
I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white.
Successfully bridging the gap between Chaplin as a silent star and a sound one. What made Chaplin survive through the transition amongst a sea of other artists is a combination of many different factors. For one, Chaplin maintaining complete creative control of his films since the beginning and still doing well in the box office gave studios confidence in his abilities as a filmmaker. His unparalleled fame and essentially lifelong character of the Tramp also helped him survive as audiences around the world wanted to hear how the character sounded. And perhaps the greatest aspect that aided in the transition was his slow pace and mixture of the two eras. For nearly a decade, neither staying a fully silent nor fully synchronized sound film, appealing to both audiences.
Keaton could have been a great star in the sound era had studios been willing to accept his argument that audiences would still appreciate dynamic visual performances over dialogue-heavy films. Characters ingrained in the silent era of film remained there, people like Buster Keaton or even the silent character of the Tramp. Keaton could not thrive in this new era as a completely silent character, but Chaplin, as a writer, filmmaker, and producer, helped transition himself into a new, revolutionary filmmaking era that no other star could do.